A warm welcome to AVPN's first South Asia Impact Capital Festival. My name is Prachi Seth, and I lead the climate action platform at AVPN. I will be your MC for this session, and I am delighted to have you join us today. A few housekeeping announcements before moving to program pop-up. To download any session resources, please click on download icon in the agenda page next to the session title. To continue chatting with our speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the messaging function or the event feed in the platform. Finally, please note that this session will be recorded and you will be able to access the recordings for 3 weeks after the festival. The focus of this panel will be on the catalytic role that philanthropic capital can play in accelerating change, with a conversation around opportunities including energy transition, energy access, mobility, land use, and industry. Without much further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers, Ms. Shloka Nath, Executive Director, India Climate Collaborative, and Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, Founder and CEO, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Shloka, over to you, please.
Thanks for the introduction, Prachi. To tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm the head of sustainability at the Tata Trusts, one of India's oldest and largest social philanthropic organizations, and I also lead the India Climate Collaborative. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the ICC, as we like to call ourselves, it's the first ever collective initiative by Indian corporates and philanthropies to invest in climate action for the country. The ICC is really formed of a network of high-profile business and philanthropic leaders, think tanks, research institutions, civil society implementers, as well as government agencies. We aim to increase the philanthropic spending on climate solutions, to increase philanthropic and citizen engagement with climate issues, and to simplify the process of investing in climate solutions. We also aim to build the capacity of the climate ecosystem by scaling solution providers, facilitating connections, and creating a strong climate narrative for the country that focuses on the core benefits of climate action to India's development pathways. India is predicted to be one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and we have already seen existing developmental issues worsen due to the climate crisis every single day. These include, but are not limited to, food insecurity caused due to extreme weather events, air pollution, which is caused due to the burning of fossil fuels, increased levels of migration due to disasters and extreme weather events, and we have lost millions of lives in India due to these issues over the last decade. As India begins its path to recovery in the aftermath of the pandemic, we do need climate solutions that are equitable and those that ensure that a just and green recovery pathway is followed and India stays on track to achieve its sustainable development and climate action goals. We need to adopt a resource-efficient, low-carbon development pathway to utilize scarce natural resources effectively. In short, our growth and recovery has to be green. India's climate mitigation and resilience stories need to be interlinked with our development. And this requires policy stability. It's going to require a rethinking of our energy subsidies to prioritize clean energy access. We need international signaling on our climate commitments, as well as a narrative that balances mitigation goals with the development principles of inclusion, sustainability, justice, and equity. India is uniquely poised to build a climate-friendly development paradigm because of the combination of path-breaking technology with increasingly favorable incentives. India's low per capita emission levels, as well as the potential of its young population and an economy that is decades away from peaking. So instead of retrofitting carbon-intensive systems of energy and mobility in the future, we can choose growth that is powered by low-carbon technologies now. In order to replenish its land, India can synthesize the best of its indigenous practices and cutting-edge contemporary research from around the world. Philanthropy has an important role to play in all of this. Philanthropic organizations have the power to increase national ambition. We have the liberty to make patient bets, be flexible, as well as take risks, and to innovate and pilot new solutions that can be scaled by private or public actors. Currently, only 2% of global philanthropic funding is estimated to fund climate action, but that figure is likely to be much lower in South Asia, particularly in India. A majority of Indian philanthropies invest in causes such as health and education with little focus on climate action. And we are hoping today that we can highlight various ways for philanthropic organizations to help India's journey towards a green recovery, as well as, of course, climate mitigation. I would now like to introduce Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, the founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, or CEEW as they're called. Arunabha and his team have played a critical role in building the South Asian climate policy knowledge base. CEEW's research and insights have informed the Indian government, civil society, and a range of implementation organizations. The ICC is very glad to have partnered with CEEW on the brief on investable philanthropic opportunities aligned with a green recovery for India. This is something that Arunabha is going to be sharing with all of us today. And so with that, Arunabha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shloka, for that introduction, and more importantly, for your leadership and your partnership. Good day, everyone. It's, as Shloka mentioned, the ICC and the Council on Energy, Environment and Water are collaborating to present the opportunities to build back better, to be more sustainable, to be more just, to square the so-called impossible trinity of jobs, growth, and sustainability. Next slide, please. So I represent the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are among Asia's leading policy research institutions, and our work cuts across energy access, renewables, but also long-term low carbon pathways and industrial sustainability, along with a focus on technology and finance. Next slide, please. So today, what I wanted to do is present before you a framework that we have developed along with ICC on how do we identify specific mitigation opportunities that yield those co-benefits that Shloka was so eloquently referring to. And we have focused on 4 themes around energy access, around the energy transition, land use change and restoration, and sustainable mobility. Now, specifically, I will talk to you about powering rural livelihoods using clean energy appliances, focusing on sustainable cold chains, landscape restoration, and triggering a new kind of urban mobility transition. But when you think about these interventions, I want you to focus also on what is the type of intervention. Are we solving for the lack of analysis that helps us understand what needs to be done better? So we will talk about new data or new market sizing opportunities. Or are we trying to demonstrate and deploy interventions at scale? And through each of these, you will see how they impact jobs, how they impact growth in terms of new investment, in being more gender inclusive, in having catalytic role in bringing in new investment. And of course, how they impact sustainability across a range of metrics, whether it's energy efficiency or increasing renewables or lowering emissions. Next slide, please. So let's start with powering rural livelihoods. The one part of the economy that has kind of absorbed the shock of the pandemic has been the rural India, as millions of migrant laborers have moved back. But what can trigger a new kind of growth in that economy? Next slide, please. What we've been focusing on is there a way to use the clean energy transition along with increasing energy access, but not just for the household, but for productive enterprises? And our estimation is that there is a $50 billion market opportunity to trigger rural enterprises that use distributed clean energy. Now, what's the problem? The problem is a lot of these technologies, the appliances, etc., have not been tested for the techno-commercial viability at scale. They're selling in the hundreds, can sell in the hundreds of thousands. So the proposed action is that we study the market potential for existing or new supply chains, but also trigger these challenge prices for prototype to market models. But at the same time, these small enterprises don't have traditional financing that can help them to adopt these new enterprises. So catalytic philanthropic finance can help to de-risk these investments and help cross the commercial value of debt. And it could even use the $14 billion agriculture infrastructure fund. But more than just technology and finance is also jobs and skilling. And often there's a lack of formal skilling and certification courses that can help these enterprises scale up with the right workforce. So our suggestion is that we design a system to use Udyam, the portal for micro, small, and medium enterprises, to match the skilled workers with these enterprises. In distributed renewable energy, already 95,000 formal jobs and more than 200,000 informal jobs have been created. Women can be 20% of micro entrepreneurs. So how do we bring a much more inclusive approach towards powering rural livelihoods using clean energy appliances? Next slide, please. The second intervention we want to talk about, which also connects the rural, but connects it also to the urban, is sustainable cold chains. And this deals with both energy access for farmers that don't have access to cold chain, but also taps into the energy transition of, can we build cold chains that are using more clean energy? Next slide, please. Now, India, as many of you probably know, loses a huge amount of its agricultural produce, the post-harvest yield, to the losses thanks to the lack of cold chains. Now, can we design a sustainable cold chain plan which uses the community-run operating model? And can we deploy pilot community-run cold chains to prove their viability? India needs about 32 million tons of cold chain infrastructure. There's likely to be a 4 or 5 times increase in the pack houses or reefer vehicles or cold storages needed over the next 2 decades. And it creates hundreds of thousands of more jobs opportunities. So connecting farmers, the farm to the fork, but through a sustainable cold chain. Next slide, please. Landscape restoration. Now, we are a densely populated country where a lot of land and a lot of land-based resources, whether it's the carbon in the soil or water under the ground, are getting degraded because of our unsustainable agricultural practices. Next slide, please. Now, farmers are often not using restoration-friendly commercial crops because, again, they have lack of access to finance or lack of access to the market. Now, the suggestion is that we can develop a financing framework for state budgets that help the transition towards more restoration-friendly crops and help to access the markets. Just one example, in Siddhi, Madhya Pradesh, created 3.75 million person days in terms of employment and about a $10 million increase in wage income just within 2 years. At the same time, restoration agriculture is limited to very small land parcels. So can we design an implementation model that helps to scale this up across landscapes, across a large number of crops? Our own government targets suggest restoring about more than 20 million hectares by 2030. So increasing that scientific know-how helps to scale up. Just in Andhra Pradesh, there's the largest natural farming practices going on in the world, with more than 700,000 farmers having been reached so far. Next slide, please. And my final intervention is about the mobility transition. Next slide, please. Now, here's the problem. We all know our cities don't have the right transport connectivity, the last mile infrastructure, they're congested. But what's more important is that the urban, peri-urban, rural link is often missing in terms of establishing sustainable transport. So our one way to deal with this is drafting a new policy that focuses on mandatory clean public transport and creating regional mobility plans that could influence 49 city clusters that generate 70% of India's GDP. That's the scale we could be looking at. At the same time, there are low transport budgets, often with governments. Commercial fleets are old and not maintained well. So can we create new income avenues or challenge prizes for cooperative models for sustainable mobility? There's a $200 billion opportunity in e-mobility targets that India set. But finally, again, there's the lack of technical capacity. So can we help create the job-specific courses, standards, certifications for governments and private institutions to upskill millions of officers in the transport department? So my final slide. The idea here is if we focused on specific interventions from rural to urban and everything in between, we can see the opportunities that are created for jobs, for new investment, for catalytic growth, but also for sustainability and building back better. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunabha. That was beautifully put. And thank you for sharing these interventions. So just sort of jumping right into it. Which of these, in your opinion, are really best primed for implementation immediately? And I think this is a question with a couple of parts, because I want to ask you immediately after this, what is the sort of groundwork that's already been done for these, and what are the current challenges? And when I refer to that, I mean, what are the challenges that are really hindering progress towards, those desirable climate development outcomes for these sectors that you forward, whether it's policy environment or financial availability, etc. And could you pinpoint with examples, if possible, some ready to go interventions which philanthropy can fund?
Thank you, Shloka. I think let's just take the last example I presented on urban mobility. Right? Just 2 weeks ago, the finance minister has talked about a major new push on urban mobility, on green urban mobility, but procuring a lot more buses is not going to be enough. Because as I presented, we don't have the route planning. We don't have the integrated modal design to bring in the regional commuters with the city dwellers. So can we tap to this announcement and say, okay, let's design the right interventions for those 40 odd city clusters, which have the huge GDP creating potential, job creating potential, and align it with this procurement of new buses. Okay, let's take another quick example, Shoka. The focus on cold chains. We know that there is this serious challenge with agriculture, right? But it's not just about where product and who is procuring the products. The point is ultimately farmer insecurity is coming from a changing climate and coming from not knowing whether their harvest is going to be going to survive before it reaches the market. So going in quickly on bringing in the cold chain infrastructure, which is sustainable, immediately brings in confidence for the small and marginal farmer, and perhaps also begins to shift the cropping pattern towards more high yield crops.
Thanks, Arunabha. That's really helpful. And I think on your point on cold chains, it does serve the dual benefits of both rural development as well as climate change mitigation. But, access to capital remains a major constraint. So what changes do you recommend in our current or existing ecosystem that's going to really enable for greater participation from private capital? How do we ensure that climate solutions are affordable for the end consumer?
I would say the philanthropic role of catalytic capital can come in a few specific ways. The first is underwriting risk on the innovation side. As I talked about, the rural livelihoods that could be powered up using clean energy appliances. Now, they require that larger testing, that commercial viability testing. Now, you don't have a huge R&D ecosystem in the country with billions of dollars going into helping these innovations. But small amounts of capital can underwrite that risk. Now, beyond that, there is the initial capital that is needed for deployment. Now, often again, because of low credit worthiness or even lack of access or being included in the financial ecosystem, small enterprises can't deploy a lot of these technologies. Let's take the cold chain example again. Now, that's where, again, philanthropic capital can come in to align with commercial capital and say, can we have some blended finance to bring that upfront capital investment available to the small enterprises, right? These are some catalytic ways in which it can happen. The third way finance story can change is the role of philanthropy to outline the broader guidelines, the ESG guidelines that are being evolved right now, as we think about more green investing in India. If philanthropy can help create that green finance framework for India, we can actually welcome a lot more money, not just from within the country, but from outside the country as well in terms of institutional capital.
That's a great point. And I think, it's one that we really need to drive. And I love how you've pointed out, the role that sort of philanthropic capital can play in driving that or triggering that ecosystem. Something else that you mentioned was urbanization, and you've talked a lot about this, previously as well. Just how urbanization is a key driver for India's future energy demand. And I think in this respect, Arunabha, how can we really encourage city level government officials to make smarter choices today, to invest in those green and climate resilient pieces of infrastructure? And when you're answering that, can you also talk a little bit about how the ongoing, urban energy transitions can actually be more just and inclusive as well?
Sure. And this is the tough one because ultimately all politics is local, Shoka. And we know that in our cities, as bustling and dynamic as they are, urban governance often is affected by a lack of the financial resources to make any real big bets. Now, can we solve for that problem along with bringing in new opportunities? And the intuitive response would be usually no. Yeah. And city officials would say, no, we don't have the money for this. And this is where, again, I would say philanthropy has a very critical role because let's take distributed energy and the mobility transition I talked about. Now, power utilities in the cities don't have space to put in new transformers, etc. But at the same time, distributed energy not only creates 7 times more jobs than utility scale solar, and even more jobs than coal power, but you can create new business models for the power utilities using distributed energy, district cooling and heating, and e-mobility charging while creating new jobs, while that reduces the power bills that consumers pay. When you're able to demonstrate that, you're able to then show that the local government is immediately responding to local citizens' needs.
Yep.
Same thing applies on air quality. If we can begin to identify the hotspots, combine it with the sustainable mobility transition, you're able to bring down, rather than expend huge amounts of resources on smog towers, you are able to immediately demonstrate that you can bring down the air pollution levels in pollution hotspots while providing new mobility solutions. So it's important not just about the financial resources available. Often what is missing is bringing those ducks in the row of the technology, the innovative business model, the private sector intervention, and the consumer and the citizen, the prosumer, to see that here's a different story that can unfold. When we go to city governments only asking for money to invest in new infrastructure, the answer will be no. You come in with a different package led by philanthropic foundations. I think the story can create a new social contract for urban governance.
Thanks, Arunabha. And is that where you also see philanthropic capital playing a unique role in that piece around sort of ensuring that it's also just and inclusive?
Absolutely, because look, India is the fastest growing urbanizing country in the world. Our current urban population would be the 3rd largest country by population. But are our cities inclusive? Are our cities dynamic? Are they attracting the best and the brightest? Are they retaining the best and the brightest? Are we providing the minimum quality of services of clean water, sanitation, clean energy, etc., mobility to everyone as a right? And this is where the moral standing of philanthropic capital becomes important. That this capital comes in with the contingency that it will only drive investments that are just, that are sustainable, that are inclusive, and offer a different model forward. Because without that moral compass, we're only building more cemented infrastructure rather than thinking how does this impact the end consumer, the citizen, the voter.
I love that we're only building more cemented infrastructure. I'm going to use that actually. So well put. And I think, with that, Arunabha, final question for you, but it's a really important one. Just a bit of a zoom out, but on the same track. What recommendations do you make for our policymakers so that we're really looking at an equitable and just green recovery pathway and that India stays on track to achieve its sustainable development and climate action goals, given all of the current domestic realities?
I have one recommendation beyond individual sectoral analysis, etc., that we can all present. One recommendation is systemic change towards sustainability is likely to happen only when the interests of the elite and the interests of the climate vulnerable converge. When we look at what's happening with renewables, what's happening with potentially about e-mobility, when we look at potentially what's possible with heavy industry and a move towards green hydrogen, we see an emerging convergence of a new green elite that also responds to the needs of the climate vulnerable. And we can then build on that one by one for many other sectors, whether it's sustainable agriculture, whether it is sanitation, whether it is water, and create those opportunities. And there are political gains to be made when the market provides the resources and the benefiting citizens provide the votes for a different future. So focus, my single recommendation is look at all the analysis, but look at these opportunities of converging the interests of the elite and the vulnerable, and we have a very different future that we can build.
I love that. And I love that you've ended on such a hopeful note. I think you've put it brilliantly, Arunabha, and thank you for all of these inputs. You know, it's interesting, 30 years ago, India was in a major economic recession. We faced a serious balance of payments problem. And of course, with economic liberalization, which was initiated in 1991, we managed to expand the role of private and foreign investment. We made the economy more market oriented. You know, we ushered in this period of high growth rates, and we really did lift millions of people above the poverty line. And 3 decades later, we now know that the climate crisis is going to require close coordination as well as ambitious action by markets, by society, by state. And as you so eloquently put it, you know, philanthropy can play an essential role in leveraging the best of all of these 3 sectors and ushering in that green recovery for India, building tangible proof points, as your interventions have today, for the co-benefits of climate action, as well as driving Indian innovation to power growth and inclusion. You know, I really hope for everyone who's listening in that this conversation has thrown some light on landmark interventions that can ensure India builds a clean and equitable development trajectory. I really urge all of us to come together to tackle this challenge, because the climate crisis is too big, too serious, and too urgent to rely on isolated actions by individual organizations or the finite resources of public institutions. I really want to thank AVPN for the opportunity to have had this very important conversation today, and I'm deeply grateful to each of you for joining us from across the world. Lastly, but not least, I would really like to thank Arunabha and the CEEW team for putting in such effort and putting together such a compelling and timely presentation. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Shloka and Arunabha, for such an enriching discussion. We have now come to the end of this session. This session was made possible with the kind support of our festival partners, Bill and Gates Foundation, Sesame Workshop India, the Rockefeller Foundation, COVID Action Collab, VNV Advisory Services, the British Asian Trust, VPP India CSR Foundation, Catalyst Management Services Private Limited, and SATPA. To continue chatting with our speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the messaging and meeting function of our festival platform. Do share the highlights of this session on the social media. Do remember to tag us at AVPN South Asia 2021 and Social Impact. Up next, the session on catalyzing green and inclusive post-COVID-19 recovery will be starting at 5:45 p.m. IST. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the festival.